So my presentation this afternoon, EU food contact legislation, where we are now and where we are going. Unsurprisingly, it will be split into two halves. The first half, where we are now. I'll explain what's currently harmonised in legislation. Have a look at the recent amendments to the plastics regulation and what comes next for that. Talk about the continuing bisphenol A saga and how it goes on and on. Draw your attention to the guidance documents that support implementation of the plastics regulation. Talk briefly about the recycling regulation, where it's got to and what's needed to finish it off, and similarly for the active and intelligent packaging regulation. Then we go on to the more interesting bit, where we're going. The Commission has been motivated to take some action on some of the unharmonised materials, both by the appearance of national legislation and also some reports, one in particular from the European Parliament. I'll talk you through those. I'll explain what actually isn't harmonised, so all the materials we're actually talking about still remaining to be done, as it were. Why we cannot repeat the process used for plastics for other materials. Have a look at the Commission's novel, indeed positively radical proposal for how to legislate printed food contact materials, which hopefully will come into being in the not too distant future. Two initiatives that are currently underway that may change the framework regulation, the one that underpins everything. A brief look at Brexit, the exit of the EU from the exit of the UK from the EU, and then attempt to draw some conclusions. Next slide, please. So what's currently harmonised? Well, we have two pieces of legislation that apply to all materials and articles. And that's the framework regulation and the GMP regulation. I'll talk about those in a bit more detail later. We have legislation that applies to 5 material types: plastics, recycled plastics, intelligent and active packaging, regenerated cellulose and ceramics. And then legislation applying to 4 specific classes of substances and products. Certain epoxy derivatives, particularly bisphenol A diglycityl ether, its bisphenol F equivalent, and nudge glycityl ethers. N-nitrosamines and substances which can be converted to them, that may be present in rubber teats and dummies. Polyamide and melamine plastic kitchenware from China and Hong Kong. And finally, bisphenol A in varnishes and coatings. Next slide, please. So, to have a look at the two pieces of legislation that apply to everything, starting with the framework regulation, regulation number 1935, dating from 2004. It's exactly what you might imagine from its title. It provides a framework for all food contact legislation. It sets out the basic rules that apply to all food contact articles and materials, regardless of whether there are more specific harmonised rules for them or not. Inevitably, the framework regulation itself is quite general. The important articles, if you like, are Article 3, which is the really famous one. It requires the use of good manufacturing practice to ensure that materials and articles do not, under their normal or foreseeable conditions of use, transfer constituents to foodstuffs in quantities which could either endanger human health or bring about an unacceptable change in the composition of the food, or bring about a deterioration in the taste or odour of the food, organoleptic characteristics as is known. Article 4 brings in special requirements for active and intelligent materials and articles. These are required because these are the only materials and articles in European food contact legislation which aren't required to be as inert as possible, obviously particularly the active ones. Article 6 explains the national specific measures that can be used to fill gaps left in harmonised EU legislation, and as we will see as we go along, these are big gaps. Articles 8 and 9, the general rules for authorising new substances, a process which has been followed so far for all the substances authorised for the plastics regulation. Article 15, the labelling rules that must be followed. Article 16, the mandatory need for a declaration of compliance. for any material that is covered by harmonised legislation, and also the need for supporting documentation to provide the evidence that backs up that declaration of compliance. And Article 17, the traceability requirements. You have to be able to trace the things that come into your factory from your immediate suppliers and what you send out to your immediate customers. So one step up and one step down the supply chain. This is so that any faulty materials can be traced and recalled with the cooperation of the entire supply chain. Next slide, please. The GMP regulation number 2023 of 2006. Once again, this applies to all food contact articles and materials, regardless of whether there are any more specific rules. The aim is to ensure that the manufacturing process is well controlled and consistent, so that food contact materials consistently remain in conformity with the legislation. It deals with things like your premises being fit for purpose, the staff aware of all the critical production systems. All this has to be documented, staff training records, etc. You need a documented quality assurance, quality control system maintained at the premises. And you need procedures which enable you to select suitable materials for the manufacturing process with a view to the final articles that you produce being safe and as inert as possible. Good manufacturing practice applies to all stages in the manufacturing chain of food contact materials, although producers of starting materials do not actually have to comply with that. And there is an annex. It covers the specific cases of printing inks in recycled plastics, although not in any detail beyond the fact that it is necessary to comply with the requirements of Article 3 of the Framework Directive. Next slide, please. You can find all the EU's harmonised legislation at this web link that I've put in red at the top of the slide. One of the things that will take you to is a useful consolidated version of the plastics regulation, incorporating all the amendments from 2011 up to the end of 2015. So that consolidated version doesn't include the amendments from 2016 onwards, which are just listed there. I'm going to talk about those. And the table on the next slide summarises the harmonised legislation that exists for specific materials and substances. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have a table. Down the left-hand side, you can see the material that is covered by harmonised legislation. Next column, brief outline of what that legislation is, the legislation numbers. You can see that plastics is the biggest. It has an enormous number of amendments, really. The third column is whether or not there is a positive list of substances that have been authorised and are associated with that particular piece of legislation. And what we see here is that in most cases, the answer to that is yes, there are positive lists. Or in some cases, it's not applicable because the legislation deals with a relatively small number of substances, perhaps just 2 or 3. So you don't need a positive list. It's more by way of a negative list on those. And the last column just explains the restrictions that are in place. The OML is the overall migration limit, SML specific migration limits, QM residual quantity limits, or the total amount of something that's allowed to be present. In general, you can see quite a lot of specific migration limits or things which are equivalent to them make up most of the restrictions. Next slide, please. Right, so just to briefly summarise that, common features. You get lists of authorised substances, otherwise known as positive lists or union lists, where these are applicable. Those are the substances which you're allowed to use. Invariably not, however, to the restriction of all others. And there are restrictions on the quantity that may be present of some of these substances. Most commonly, these are specific migration limits, and substances with specific migration limits are actually those where the toxicological evidence that went with the technical dossier that was sent to EFSA when a company was notifying them to get them listed, did not support the concept of them being safe at a migration level equal to the overall migration limit of 60 mg per kilo food. Next slide, please. So, there have been 5 amendments to the plastic regulation since the end of 2015. 1 in 2016, 1 in 2017, 3 in 2018. I'm going to consider the 4 that are in blue first, and I'm going to leave Regulation 213 of 2018 until I actually talk about bisphenol A, which will be immediately after I finish talking about the plastics regulation. So, next slide, please, which will be Regulation 1416 of 2016. This is a big and important amendment. It did something that they all do. It made changes in addition to the union list of approved substances following recent EFSA assessments of the safety of substances. But in this particular case, we started to see a difference in that most of the new approvals were not universal. Prior to 2016, most of the substances approved for the plastics regulation could be used in any plastic, and there weren't that many other restrictions put on them either. But in the case of this particular amendment, we see the beginning of an increasing trend where substances are limited to certain polymers and or certain foods and or specific applications of temperature and time. And this is a trend that's continued in the more recent amendments, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So you can take it as read that trend is continuing at the moment. It also made some pretty fundamental changes. New specific migration limits for metals, new food simulants, different to the ones introduced back in 2011, changes to which food simulants are assigned to which foods, a new definition of what hot filling and what sort of migration testing needed to go with it, changes, very significant changes to the testing times and temperatures for specific migration, which actually broke away from the conditions used for overall migration testing, which although was standardized in this particular amendment, were suddenly different from those used for specific migration. And that's disconnection now between specific migration testing conditions and overall migration testing conditions has undoubtedly made migration testing more complex in the EU. And finally, this amendment reintroduced the substitute overall migration tests for cases where vegetable oil, simulant D2, cannot actually be used because of overwhelming technical difficulties. Next slide, please. So, the other 3 recent amendments that I'm going to talk about here, firstly, Regulation 752 of 2017, did the standard housekeeping stuff, 6 new substances added, imposed a new SML for nickel, 0.02 mg per kilo. Now that was interesting because it was only 10% of the acceptable daily intake. And this assignment of only part of the acceptable daily intake to dietary exposure via food contact is another increasing trend with this legislation. Way back, prior to this, you used to get the whole of the ADI or TDI assigned to the SML, but that is now changing. This particular amendment also clarified the rules for selection of simulants for overall migration. That is also an important thing, which means, once again, this is another amendment you have to pay attention to when picking conditions for migration testing. The 2 other amendments in 2018, Regulation 79 and Regulation 831, are just housekeeping amendments, adding new substances or amending restrictions. Next slide, please. Okay, so that brings us away from the plastics regulation for now to the continuing bisphenol A saga, which okay, does impinge upon the plastics regulation, but it goes a bit wider as well. Going all the way back to the beginning of 2015, we had what was actually, I believe, the 7th EFSA scientific opinion on bisphenol A. So it keeps looking at the toxicology of bisphenol A. And this one was slightly different and certainly more all-encompassing than in the previous ones, divided into 2 parts. Part 1, an exposure assessment. It didn't only cover dietary exposure, but also covered non-dietary exposure. And part 2, a very detailed toxicological assessment and risk characterization resulting from that. And it's still available to read on the web, the web link highlighted there. The conclusion was that diet is the main source of exposure to bisphenol A for all population age groups. And within that diet, canned food and non-canned meat and meat products are the main dietary contributors in most countries and for most age groups. That last one's had a bit of an oddity connected with it. As soon as bisphenol A enters the body of a mammal, it is converted into a conjugated form. And so bisphenol A in non-canned meat and meat products you would expect to be conjugated. In actual fact, you find unconjugated BPA in non-canned meats, which, as I say, remains a puzzle. We don't understand why at the moment. Next slide, please. Okay, so what EFSA did from this opinion was set a temporary tolerable dietary intake at 4 micrograms per kilo body weight per day, which implied a maximum possible specific migration limit of 0.24 mg per kilo. That TDI was reduced by just over a factor of 12 from the previous TDI. As a TDI, it was made temporary to account for uncertainties about some of the possible toxicological effects of bisphenol A, particularly on the mammary gland, reproductive, neurological, immune and metabolic systems, and also pending the outcome of long-term studies involving prenatal and postnatal exposure to bisphenol A. So that particularly covers pregnant ladies and infants both before and after birth, being undertaken by the National Toxicology Program and the FDA in the United States. So EFSA was always planning to come back and have a re-evaluation of bisphenol A once that very in-depth 2-year study was completed. However, comparing the temporary TDI with the average and high exposures that EFSA estimated, we actually see that there's no problem in Europe. Average exposure populations, factors of 10 to 20 below the temporary tolerable dietary intake, and high exposure populations, factors of 3 to 9 below the temporary TDI. So you haven't got health concerns, whether they're from either dietary exposure or non-dietary exposure. And although there's considerable uncertainty in the non-dietary exposure estimates, it must be borne in mind that most of the exposure comes from the dietary route. Now, worth noting that despite this favourable EFSA opinion on bisphenol A, we still had a French suspension of placing on the market of any packaging container or utensil containing bisphenol A and intended to come into contact with food. That's been in place since 1st of January 2013. Under European law, where you have a substance covered by harmonised legislation and you have different pieces of legislation for it in force in a member state, then the legislation in the member state is not legal. So the French legislation must at some point be found to be illegal, although obviously you would say that since it's had 5 years so far, the Commission is clearly not rushing. And there is a suspicion that actually the Commission is gradually working towards a ban on bisphenol A, and thus won't need to take any action on the French legislation. Next slide, please. as a result of all of that, in 2018, we actually got a regulation dedicated to bisphenol A. And it covered the use of bisphenol A in varnishes and coatings, and also amended the plastics regulation regarding the use of bisphenol A in plastic food contact materials. Came into force on the 4th of March this year and actually applied in full from the 6th of September this year. It set a specific migration limit of only 0.05 mg per kilo for bisphenol A in either varnishes, coatings or plastics. So that only used 20% of the temporary TDI, which does seem a little harsh considering that diet is the major route of exposure. But one has to bear in mind that in reality that is a political rather than a scientific decision. And the Commission, looking tough, or not just looking tough, but acting tough on the EPA, tougher than perhaps it needed to in the light of the scientific evidence. Even tougher, in the case of packaging for infant foods, the specific migration limit is set at non-detectable, so that's at less than 10 ppb. These limits apply to plastics, varnishes and coatings. Specific migration testing of varnishes and coatings is done using exactly the same conditions as one uses for plastics. As always, for harmonised legislation, you need declaration of compliance for bisphenol A in varnishes and coatings, and you need to back that up by keeping suitable supporting documentation that proves the statements in your declaration of compliance are correct. Finally, varnishes, coatings and plastics legally placed on the market before the 6th of September under the old rules may remain on the market until exhaustion of stocks. It's kind of very standard EU thing. Next slide, please. So, continuing bisphenol A saga, is this the end? Well, sadly, no. Even during the consultation period for the bisphenol A regulation, some member of the European Parliament's Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety objected to it on the grounds that it did not go far enough and failed to ensure a high level of protection of human health, particularly for the vulnerable groups, pregnant women and their unborn children. The objectors argued that only a total ban would be sufficient, despite the fact that scientific evidence said it wasn't necessary. The objection was finally rejected in the committee as the majority of its members found that the Commission proposal was a step in the right direction and it would be better to protect young children, infants and young children with a very low, non-detectable specific migration limit quickly, rather than having to wait for a new proposal from the Commission. So that's how we ended up with the non-detectable SML for infant foods. Next slide, please. And it continues to continue. EFSA has set up another working group of experts to evaluate new scientific evidence of the potential effects of bisphenol A on the immune system. The origin of that, a couple of earlier papers published in 2014, which throws some doubts. EFSA initially had a look at them, decided that they actually didn't constitute strong enough evidence, but since then, in September 2016, they decided that bisphenol A might affect the immune system in animals, but the evidence was too limited to draw any conclusions for human health. As said earlier, EFSA always planned a review following the conclusion of the 2-year study by the US National Toxicology Program. This study is just completed its peer review stages. It doesn't appear to have reached any new dramatic conclusions, and certainly as a result in the US, it's expected that the TDI for bisphenol A will remain at 50 micrograms per kilo body weight per day, just as it used to be in Europe before the new temporary TDI was introduced. You can keep following the story. EFSA launched online public consultation on its draft protocol for the hazard assessment of BPA, and you can see that and everything since, and how it continues at the web link down the bottom there. Next slide, please. So, guidance documents supporting implementation of the plastics regulation. Two of these have been published. The first one was guidance on information in the supply chain. It was published in November 2013, 32 pages long. It clarifies what information each company needs to pass on to its customers and what supporting information it needs to keep to satisfy regulators. Despite this, when regulatory authorities have looked at declaration of compliance, it's clear that there are many inadequate ones out there in the European Union, especially those from small and sometimes also those from medium-sized companies. The second guidance document that's been published is actually guidance on the regulation itself. That was published in 2014 and is 45 pages long. I'm going to talk about that one in more detail over the next two slides. You can find these two guidance documents at the web link there. It's interesting that both these guidance documents are actually longer than the original plastics regulation itself, if you don't count the appendices connected to it, most of which are, of course, the very big long union list of approved substances. There is a third guidance document that's now been around for ages in draft form. It's on how to interpret the rules for testing. It runs to about 100 pages with another 100 or so pages in the appendices. So a very long document. I will just mention that in a few minutes' time as well. Next slide, please. So, we've covered the guidance document on information in the supply chain. Let's look in a bit more detail at the guidance document on the regulation itself, the one that was published in 2014. What it does is it provides a much fuller explanation of the scope of the plastics regulation, gives good definitions of certain terms that weren't necessarily that well defined in the original regulation. So things like rubbers, thermoplastics, elastomers, additives, and polymer production aids. How some of these are not plastics, and in the case of polymer production aids, what they are, and why some of them, at the very least, do not need to be on the union list. Actually, most of them do not need to be on the union list. Explanations are in it concerning which substances definitely need to be included on the plastics regulation positive list, and clarification of why substances are exempted from that list, and some limited guidance on how to deal with such substances. So you have the polymer production aids, of which some are actually in the union list, but most of them are only in national legislation. The aids to polymerization, very few of those are on the union list, though you can find some, single figures probably. The rest of them are either in national legislation or are subject to risk assessment in accordance with what's in Article 19 of the plastics regulation. The non-intentionally added substances, not listed anywhere, subject to risk assessment in accordance with Article 19 again. Colorants, you'll find these in national legislation. And solvents, once again in national legislation or covered by risk assessment. Has to be noted that there are two colorants in the positive list at the back of the plastics regulation, just titanium dioxide and carbon black. The others, as I say, you'll have to look at national legislation to deal with those. Next slide, please. These guidelines also clarify the status of biocides in food contact materials and articles into various categories. Processed biocides, so things which are added to the actual production process, the polymerization medium, to prevent the growth of bacteria there. They're regarded as polymer production aids, so do not necessarily have to be listed in the union list, but if not, it should be listed in national legislation. Surface biocides added to plastics to make sure that bacteria cannot grow on their surface in use. They're regarded naturally as plastics additives because they have a technical effect in the finished article. So they need to be listed on the union list. And preservatives, food preservatives, which naturally enough are treated as food additives. Those first two classes of biocides, the process biocides and the surface biocides, also need to be notified under the biocides regulation, number 528 of 2012. Union guidelines also contain some useful discussion on what dual-use additives are. These are additives that can be used both as food additives and additives in plastics. And they give, and there is there a list of dual-use additives, which, although it claims to be non-exclusive, I may have gaps as far as I can see, is pretty much exclusive. They all seem to be there to me. That is useful. And there is also a slight clarification on the position of nanomaterials, in so much as it defines them as described in Commission Recommendation 696 of 2011, which you can find by Googling it, and a statement that once it's decided how to implement this definition, given in Commission Recommendation 696 into General Food Law, the plastics regulation will actually be amended accordingly. Next slide, please. I mentioned the draft guidelines on interpretation of the testing rules, which have been around for ages, but haven't actually been published. I won't discuss them in detail because to do so would be a presentation in its own right. With appendices, they run some 200 pages. But what they do usefully include is some clarification on choice of simulants and exposure conditions, and particularly the use of worst-case simulants to cut down on the amount of migration testing that needs to be done. Explanations on the use of reduction factors. Reduction factors, one thing that people certainly find confusing about the plastics regulation. Discussion on when it is appropriate to use screening and modelling approaches rather than formal migration testing, and a really useful definition of some generally accepted functional barriers. It would be really useful actually if that got published somewhere, because that is good. Will we see it? Well, 4 years ago, the European Commission expected this document to be published before the end of 2014. 2 years ago, we expected it to be published in the autumn of 2016, as they say. And it now appears that the Legal Services Unit of the European Commission have raised objections to publication. So no progress has been made, and I believe this guideline to be missing in action, or perhaps more accurately, missing due to inaction. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, what comes next for the plastics regulation? Well, it is certain that we'll continue to get the housekeeping of the approved list of substances. Once EFSA gives a positive evaluation of a substance submitted in a technical dossier, it will be included on the union list in future amendments to the plastics regulation. It seems probable that we're going to get stricter rules for the data needed in technical dossiers for food contact substances that can be used in foods for babies and infants, and perhaps also for children. It's not certain, but possible. And if you bear this list in mind when I talk about the novel approach for printed food contact materials later, you'll actually see if the Commission adopts this novel approach, it will actually address all these things by default for printed food contact materials. If it were to come back and actually use that novel approach for plastics, once again, it would automatically address all these things which are perceived as problems currently. So action to improve the quality of declarations of compliance, particularly those by small, to some extent those from medium-sized companies. Improvement to the flow of information along the supply chain, improvement of the quality of risk assessments of non-intentionally added substances, which is done to a vast array of standards. Well, standards is the wrong word. Different laboratories do this in totally different ways and get totally different answers, which is a fairly hopeless situation. And it's generally accepted that there needs to be a greater emphasis on evaluation of the final printed food contact materials rather than all the things that go to make that up, which is really currently what the plastics regulation addresses in the main. It took over 30 years to submit and evaluate technical dossiers for approximately 1,050 substances for the plastics regulation. So this way of doing things is not ideal as a template for the other materials yet to be harmonised. More on that later. Next slide, please. Briefly, the recycling regulation. What comes next for that? So this is Regulation 282 of 2008, and it has been complete since 2008, apart from a union list of approved recycling processes. Until this union list is actually published by the Commission, companies dependent on national law to actually implement recycling processes in a given country, member state that is. EFSA have nearly finished reviewing the recycling processes for which valid submissions were sent to them prior to 2014. Well, most of them prior to 2014. They've allowed some to sneak in since then, which initially they said they weren't going to, but they have. About 130 processes for PET have been favourably assessed, and you can see the document that summarises that quite well, this particular web link. I've put the processes here in parentheses. Because in reality, there are only kind of 6 or 7 different processes. And what EFSA got overwhelmed with was receiving dossiers from anybody that implemented one of these 6 or 7 processes in various countries, which was not what was supposed to happen at all. But once it had started to happen, they continued to accept the dossiers. So they had in the end no option really but to evaluate them. EFSA have also approved 2 open-loop recycling processes for HDPE and several closed-loop processes. So those are ones where nothing can get in from the outside, mainly for packaging crates for PET, which is no problem, and polyolefins. EFSA have yet to announce decisions on most other recycled plastics due to technical safety concerns. And those technical safety concerns tend to be how absorbent the plastic is to contaminants. So if contaminants can easily get into the plastic, it becomes quite hard to clean it up during recycling processes. So there's perhaps a small risk from traces of toxic things like insecticides and weed killers and things which might have been introduced by the general public before they recycled a plastic article. But perhaps more seriously, food can enter the plastic, can go rancid and give you organoleptic problems, in which generally the only solution is to blend the recycled plastic with a bigger amount of virgin plastic until the organoleptic issue is no longer a concern. Anyway, once the assessment process is complete, the European Commission will establish a register of approved processes and a date for that to actually go live, as it were, and that will fully implement this regulation at last. To be said, the whole process has taken longer than expected, and there's still no date after 5 years of work. However, pleased to say that the Commission is currently consulting on establishing a register, so maybe the long wait will soon be over. Certainly hope so. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, the Active and Intelligent Packaging Regulation, number 450 from 2009, This is another one that's complete apart from a union list, in this case of approved substances. EFSA had all the technical dossiers with them by the end of February 2011 and published a registry of valid applications in mid-2012. It only contained 45 substances, so we all thought that this would be a fairly short process. A number of the substances have been favourably assessed. You can see that at the web link given. However, the Commission will only finally authorise the union list of substances after EFSA has delivered its opinion on all the substances included in that 2012 register. It's now taken 6 years and we still do not have a date. Surely it must be soon. As you'll see, EFSA can kind of do 35 or so dossiers a year, so it's had a long time. Next slide, please. So that concludes the first half of the training. Now, the interesting bit, where are we going? So here I'm going to talk about some national legislation that has been part of the motivation for the Commission to actually start legislating beyond plastics. And similarly, some reports, particularly one from the European Parliament, similarly motivated the Commission. I should explain what is not harmonised, why we cannot repeat the process used for plastics for other materials, look at the novel proposal that the Commission has made for the regulation of printed food contact materials, look at an ongoing review of the framework regulation, which has really just got underway this year, and also have a look at a proposed EU regulation on transparency in the food chain, which might well have consequences for exactly what needs to be included in future amendments of the framework regulation. And finally, the exit of the UK from the EU, just very briefly, before drawing some conclusions. Next slide, please. So, national legislation. A result of a lack of progress, really, to harmonise new materials beyond those that I listed back on slide 7, is that member states have definitely started to lose patience with the Commission and have started writing new national legislation. And examples include Germany's draft inks ordinance. Okay, the Germans have drafted, it's kind of ready to go, but the Germans have agreed to hold it back pending harmonised legislation. As it happens, not on printing inks, but the printed food contact materials. Germany could still actually lose patience again and actually publish that. Germany, again, a measure on mineral oil hydrocarbons in recycled paper and board, which supplements their BFR recommendation 36. Recent revisions of the Dutch packaging and food utensils regulation possibly wouldn't have happened had the Commission been moving ahead quickly on harmonising the non-harmonised materials. Belgium issued a royal decree on the 16th of September 2016 on varnishes and coatings due to frustration with a lack of legislation in those areas. This was an interesting one in so much as it was done very collaboratively with the coatings industry, and what has resulted actually looks like a very pragmatic and usable piece of legislation as a consequence of that. And way back in 2011, the Spanish moved ahead with their decree 847, which covered quite a lot of materials which aren't harmonised: adhesives, elastomers, rubbers, ion exchange resins, silicones, varnishes and coatings, plastic polymer production aids, plastic aids to polymerization, and waxes. So, the Commission's job is harmonisation. So, seeing that national legislation is increasing, and non-harmonised legislation is increasing, should really give them an incentive to take action. But it seems to have actually taken a little bit more than that to get things moving. But as we'll see, things are now moving. Next slide, please. So, a particularly significant thing was in 2016, the European Parliament issued a report on regulation of food contact materials, which was very critical of the slow progress on plastics, slow progress on completing the recycling plastics regulation, and also the slow progress on completing the active and intelligent packaging regulation, and the lack of any progress at all on legislating for the non-harmonised materials. So that obviously clearly raised the stakes further for the Commission. And because the Commission knew it was coming, they themselves commissioned the Joint Research Centre in Italy to carry out a study on the effects of non-harmonised food contact regulation. That resulted in a 132-page report entitled Non-Harmonised Food Contact Materials in the EU, the Regulatory and Market Situation, which found that there's a lack of transparency across member states in how they deal with non-harmonised materials. National requirements in different countries can be difficult to access, not always the case. The German BFR is very easy to access, but Italian national legislation is highly scattered. It's not drawn together in one place. So you have to be an expert in Italian legislation in order to dig out their national requirements. There are multiple different sets of testing requirements for non-harmonised materials across the EU. And there's a lack of standardised enforcement methods, which is probably a bad thing, and compliance testing methods. Although in the latter case, I'm a bit sceptical, as well as there ever be standardised compliance testing methods for thousands of substances. It's just too expensive a system to bring into place. It's certainly a fair comment. There is a lack. Anyway, both the above organisations concluded that something needed to be done. And as we will see, the Commission is actually starting to do something. Next slide, please. So, what's not harmonised? Well, essentially, anything that you can think comes into contact with food that was not mentioned in the table on slide 7. So, printing inks, varnishes and coatings, paper and board, adhesives, glass, metals and alloys, cork, rubbers, ion exchange resins, silicones, textiles, waxes, wood, and recycled materials from the above list, of which paper and board, glass and metals are particularly important, being recycled in big tonnages. Next slide, please. So, what would happen if we actually repeated the authorization process used for plastics for these other materials? Well, in the last 30 years, EFSA have risk assessed approximately 1,050 substances for use in plastics. Their capacity, given the way they currently operate, is to risk assess 30 to 40, mainly on average 35 substances a year. Let's say 40. If we look at some of these non-harmonised materials, the Council of Europe resolution on food contact paper includes somewhere around about 1,000 non-evaluated substances. The CP guide on coatings lists another 550 non-evaluated substances. The Swiss positive list for inks in their inks ordinance contains around 1,250 non-evaluated substances, and it's pretty easy to believe, particularly looking at the FDA regulation on adhesives, that adhesives could contain another 1,000 non-evaluated substances. To risk assess 3,800, which is what that adds up to, new substances at the current rate, is going to take about 100 years. And even after that 100 years, there would still be another 9 materials to go. So a new approach is clearly needed from that. Next slide, please. So, the Commission have committed themselves to legislating introducing a regulation for printed food contact materials. And they've published a document. You can find the details at the top web link there, published in 2017, which talks about the two possible approaches that the Commission could take. And these two approaches are a traditional approach, as used for plastics, or a novel new approach. Now, although the document constantly emphasises the fact that the Commission doesn't favour one or the other at the moment, if you read it properly, it clearly favours the novel new approach, because it admits that the traditional approach is just going to take too long and involve too much time and money, and probably would be a waste of precious resources. So they're seriously looking at this novel new approach. And this approach involves the use of accredited designated bodies to decide whether a printed food contact material is compliant or not, a documentation database where companies lodge all the information needed by the designated bodies to evaluate compliance of their products, a rule base containing the rules and procedures that designated bodies have to follow to evaluate compliance, compliance certificates issued by the designated bodies rather than by the companies that make the materials, a governance committee comprising the Commission and Member States with representatives from designated bodies, some of the companies that manufacture food contact materials and some food companies, and overall control of the system by Member State competent authorities. I'm going to look at each of these bullet points in turn in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So, designated bodies. These will be chosen and accredited by Member State competent authorities. So those are the enforcement authorities in each of the Member States. They would typically be a mixture of commercial testing laboratories, consultants, and some of the law firms that consult on food contact legislation as well. Such organisations would be independent from the food contact material manufacturers, ensuring impartiality and confidentiality, in so much as, each company's information will be kept confidential from the others. And the designated bodies will be responsible for evaluating compliance of each material used in a printed food contact article and certifying compliance of the final article by reviewing the compliance information that's been placed in the documentation database by each food contact material manufacturer, and asking questions like, does it identify all the possible migrants? Have all the required testing and measurements been done? Is there sufficient toxicology available on all the substances? And that particular question will undoubtedly involve estimates of exposure using exposure modelling, and may also involve the use of things like the threshold of toxicological concern to avoid unnecessary further toxicological testing where it can be avoided. The designated bodies will evaluate the information for each food contact material against the requirements in the rule base and issue compliance certificates where appropriate. Designated bodies will also have to document the rules and reasoning they've used to establish compliance or non-compliance for each material and final article in what are currently being called dossiers, and issuing a compliance certificate for the final printed food contact material article, if appropriate. Next slide, please. The quality of assessments, particularly those where the risk is highest, will be audited by Member State competent authorities. More about that later. Something the Commission has stated is that evaluations by designated bodies must be conservative in order to continue to protect consumers. So they should only involve low exposure cases where there is well-established toxicological data using accepted tests and procedures. And There will need to be criteria established for this, both in general rules written by EFSA and further detailed guidance from EFSA to make sure that designated bodies all act in the same way in as far as possible. If a substance fails to meet the conservative criteria, for example, if exposure to it is too high, or there is identification of a specific toxicological concern, as a fallback, an EFSA evaluation will be needed. That would lead us now to an authorization or not, an inclusion on a union list. However, as a note of caution there, the Commission does need to be careful not to introduce rules that make designated bodies too conservative, resulting in EFSA being overwhelmed by evaluations. If they're like the current technical dossiers, we know that EFSA can't deal with any more than 40 a year. Maybe they could actually be simplified from that, but at the moment that's not clear. Next slide, please. The documentation database, well, that's going to contain the compliance documentation from food contact material manufacturers, both declarations of compliance and their supporting documentation. Then food contact material evaluations by the designated bodies, which they will document in dossiers, which, if you like, will mean that the supporting documentation gets put into a pretty standardized format, which will be an advantage over the current system. Compliance certificates for the materials that make up printed food contact materials and the final printed food contact material article will be issued by designated bodies and stored in the documentation database. So those are the things that you would expect food companies to actually get to look at in helping them with the knowledge that the materials they're using to pack their foods are indeed compliant. Member state competent authorities and EFSA and possibly the Commission, although that hasn't been explicitly stated yet, will have access to all the data in the documentation database. Designated bodies will have access to all the information relevant to their evaluations. So somebody is going to have to be able to release the material that designated bodies will need to see to those designated bodies. Food contact material manufacturers will only have access to the data that they input. Food businesses will have access to some of the food contact material manufacturers' non-confidential information, so declarations of compliance and, one suspects, compliance certificates issued by designated bodies. Some limited public access is also being considered to non-confidential information, such as lists of materials, food contact manufacturers, and designated bodies. Okay, I'm not personally sure how useful that last one will be, but time will tell. Next slide, please. On to the rule base. This will be legislated for to set out the main obligations. What procedures will need to be followed to use the system? The rules necessary for hazard and exposure assessments need to be written by EFSA. And then the rules for risk assessments following those hazard and exposure assessments, once again, will need to be written by EFSA. Standards such as technical procedures and analytical methods, where they exist for things, will also be stored in the rule base. And there'll be guidance covering complex technical detail deliberately kept out of the legislation to keep it manageable. Situations where it can be foreseen that flexibility is needed in interpretation. This is a slightly odd one. I've included it because the Commission has stated it. I'm not entirely sure what it means. Situations where change is expected. Okay, I think we'll just have to watch that one. Internal rules made by designated bodies will only be allowed if there are no other rules which they can apply. They'll have to document them and their reasoning behind choosing them. And the possibility that they'll need to be notified to EFSA is also being discussed. Next slide, please. Compliance certificates. These will be issued by designated bodies for any of the food contact materials that go into final printed food contact materials and articles, and the final printed material or article itself. There's no detail available at the moment about the information that will be in these, but declarations of compliance are the most likely template, I would speculate. So you would expect all the information that's currently required for plastics to be required for printed food contact materials. Next slide, please. The governance committee will be established by the regulation and will comprise the Commission, representatives of the member states, presumably one each, hopefully not more than one each, and also some representatives from designated bodies, companies manufacturing food contact material and food companies. No mention at the moment has been made of trade associations, but you would think that that might actually be a better place to draw some of these representatives from. Certainly, the Commission will have to be careful not to make the governance committee too enormous and thus unwieldy. The governance committee will deal with risk management and procedural matters, including determining whether further formal rules are needed, sometimes preparing these, or if they're more complicated, passing them on to EFSA for preparation, discuss specific cases of where there's high exposure or high toxicity, where substances have been sent or where materials have been sent for EFSA evaluation, and help EFSA prioritize these, discuss ongoing cases, and issue a public list of issues where they are identified. Next slide, please. Control of the system will be by member state competent authorities, who will obviously accredit the designated bodies, audit the work of designated bodies to verify that it is adequate, monitor the risk evaluations by designated bodies to ensure that the rules are being followed, and overrule those designated bodies if necessary, presumably if the member state competent authority disagrees with the conclusions. Audits and monitoring will obviously not be of all dossiers because there's going to be thousands of them, but will concentrate on cases where exposure is higher and or where more toxic substances are involved. Exposure is important here because if you've got a very toxic substance and exposure is zero, there's no risk, whereas if you've only got a moderately toxic substance or a mildly toxic substance and exposure is high, then you could have a situation where you wouldn't want to say it was compliant. These will be new functions for competent authorities who will almost certainly need extra resources and thus extra money. Next slide, please. So, what are the potential benefits of this novel approach? Well, they're actually quite compelling. Each company in the supply chain needs to ensure that all the information showing compliance is in the documentation database, therefore automatically improving information flow along the supply chain, overcoming one of the things for which the current system is criticised. Supporting documentation will be formalised and stored in dossiers in the documentation database, facilitating access by member state competent authorities. A more streamlined and easier to control version of the current system. Risk assessment by designated bodies is independent of food contact material manufacturers. Independence of thought is always a good thing. The compliance certificates issued by designated bodies will contain all the required information, overcoming the deficits seen in declarations of compliance from small companies and sometimes also from medium-sized companies. EFSA only becomes involved where strictly necessary, so it's limited resources are used in a much more effective way, as long as, of course, it's not overwhelmed by a large number of dossiers being referred up to it. Food contact material manufacturers should be able to get their products to market quicker, because these evaluations, you think, would only take a few weeks at most, rather than the months it takes to put a technical dossier together, then submit it to EFSA, and where it joins a queue. And as we've already discussed, EFSA can only do so many of them a year. So if yours is dossier number 105 or 120, you can expect to wait 3 years in reality for it to be assessed. Food businesses should get more consistent information on the printed food contact materials they use, compliance certification by the designated bodies. Again, overcoming one of the often mentioned downsides of the current system. So it will be a lot quicker than the traditional approach used for plastics. And if successful, it can also be applied to other food contact materials, even plastics themselves. A lot of the things that can be evaluated under the system would, of course, be plastics. Next slide, please. However, there are some potential difficulties, as always, with any new approach. Striking the right balance between consumer protection and conservative evaluations, so that consumers are fully protected and EFSA is not overwhelmed by lots of dossiers, or if you like, lots of printed materials being referred up to them, because they'll only be able to do a certain number per year. It'd be important how the responsibilities are divided up in the supply chain. Certainly, experience suggests that expecting too much to be dealt with at the level of the producer of the final food contact material, which are often small, medium-sized enterprises with limited resources, may well result in disappointment. There will need to be appeals procedures, because what happens when various bodies disagree on the outcome of an evaluation. Need more resources to member state competent authorities, so that means more national government expenditure, which the national government's going to have to agree to. Need to get the member states themselves to agree on the novel approach. Need to get the Commission's legal services, notoriously conservative, to agree to the novel approach. Need to get the European Parliament to agree to the novel approach. And then $1 million question in many ways, or probably should say €1 million question. How do we keep the documentation database secure from the activities of hackers, which we see so often in headlines in the modern world? That's a tough one. Next slide, please. So, how long will this all take? Well, the first thing to note is it's currently on hold awaiting political validation, which means really the agreement of all those bodies mentioned on the last slide, the member states, the legal services, the European Parliament. If it goes ahead, there will be a lot of work involved to actually bring it to fruition. The framework regulation will need to be amended to accommodate all the new things introduced by the new approach. Because at the moment, the framework regulation lays down that things have to be done the way they were done for plastics. So clearly need amending. The regulation for printed food contact materials itself will need to be drafted, consulted on and finalised. Accreditation procedures for designated bodies will need to be drafted, consulted on and finalised. The rules base will need to be drafted, again consulted on and finalised. The documentation database will need to be set up, made secure and ready for population. Member state competent authorities will need to recruit more staff because of their extra responsibilities and attract more funding, and designated bodies will need to be accredited. Then we'll be in a position to go. As I say, this will all take time, and history teaches us that food contact moves slowly. So I feel it's several years away. Let's optimistically say 3, with a medium pessimistic, with a medium optimistic viewpoint of 5 years and a pessimistic viewpoint of 10. But let's hope pessimism doesn't sway. Let's be optimistic. 3 to 5 years. If the novel approach does not go ahead, then the Commission either has to come up with another new approach, which would be challenging, or stick with the traditional approach as used for plastics and just accept that it's going to take over 100 years to complete for all the non-harmonized materials. Next slide, please. So, currently, the Commission is evaluating the effectiveness of the framework regulation. So, both its effectiveness and how this impacts on the Commission's approach to regulation of food contact materials in general. Back in May this year, the EU published an evaluation website. So you can certainly go and have a look at that. In July, it employed an independent consultant to conduct a study lasting some 15 months and report back on the effectiveness of the framework regulation as a framework for food contact legislation. The first workshop, first of several workshops that will explain where they've got to and what they found so far, was actually on the 28th of September this year, and that's available on the internet as well. In the fourth quarter of 2019, the independent consultants are going to publish and disseminate their results, and early in 2020, the Commission should publish its response, saying what it accepts and what it doesn't accept, I guess. So any changes recommended and accepted could, of course, have a significant impact and cause the framework regulation to be amended, and will cause the framework regulation to be amended. You can see any of the things which I've mentioned above and keep up with what's happening at the web link that I've given here. Next slide, please. We also currently have a proposed EU regulation on transparency in the food chain. And that first appeared back in April this year. And you can read about it at the web link factually given at the top of this slide. And it applies to EU risk assessment in relation to all these things listed here, which are all the things which we generally call food law, and also highlighted in red our very own framework regulation on food contact materials. So definitely, if this goes ahead, the framework regulation will be affected in some way. Next slide, please. So the key element of this proposed new legislation are to ensure more transparency by allowing citizens to have automatic and immediate access to all safety-related information, and assumes that means toxicology, submitted by industry in the risk assessment process. A bit skeptical about that myself. Citizens in general don't have the expertise to understand what they're looking at. NGOs have the expertise, but perhaps a skewed opinion on what things actually mean. Create a common European register of Commission studies to guarantee that companies applying for an authorization submit all relevant information and do not hold back on favourable studies. Well, that sounds laudable. I doubt if it exists very much in the food contact area. But anyway, as I say, certainly a laudable aim. Allow additional studies to be requested either by EFSA or the Commission, and financed by the EU budget. Well, additional studies can be requested at the moment by EFSA, should they not be happy with the ones included in a technical dossier. Financed by the EU budget. Currently, they're financed by the companies submitting the dossier. I can't imagine financed by the EU budget is going to be particularly popular, since it's already a very large budget. It will also require consultation of stakeholders and the public on studies submitted by industry to support product authorization requests. Once again, the possibility that some of your stakeholders could well be biased and the public just possibly haven't got the depth of technical knowledge to understand what is going on here. It will increase member state involvement in the European Food Safety Authority's government structure and scientific panels. Not entirely sure how, but certainly that much sounds laudable. And strengthens risk communication to citizens with common actions to enhance consumer confidence by promoting public awareness and understanding and better explaining scientific opinions expressed by EFSA, as well as the basis of risk management decisions. Once again, you're going to be trying to talk to people that won't necessarily know what you're talking about unless you find a new language to talk about toxicological outcomes in. We will see. Next slide, please. So, what are the possible impacts on our framework regulation for food contact? If the proposed EU regulation on transparency in the food chain becomes law, the framework regulation will need to be amended in order to accommodate the requirements for EFSA to notify the Member States and European Commission of a regulatory submission and make available the safety-related information, particularly toxicological data, needed for this transparency. Also, to accommodate public access to the safety-related information in the submission, the need to record Commission studies in the Common European Register, consultations with stakeholders and the public on submissions before final approval, and clarification of the information that companies can request remain confidential, because there definitely will be some of that. And you can see that this would include things like detailed description of starting substances, formulations, preparations, etc., composition of materials, manufacturing methods, perhaps impurities, migration testing results. Normally these are treated as confidential, and trademark information. Note that one imagines toxicology will not be confidential, because that is the safety information that will need to be made transparent. Additionally, EFSA will need to issue detailed new guidance on how exactly submissions will be done and how the whole process will work. Remember that this is a draft regulation and subject to consultation. You can see the consultation at this web link here, so you can keep track of what's happening. Difficult to predict exactly what will happen to the framework regulation if this draft regulation on transparency comes into effect. Also added to which you have the review of the framework regulation itself underway until the end of 2019, and a need for changes anyway if the novel approach for regulation of printed food contact materials is adopted. What you can say is that overall there will be amendments to the framework regulation, and it's going to look very different, I feel, by the time they're all incorporated. Next slide, please. Right, the exit of the UK from the EU. If you've been following this at all in the news, you'll realise that it's still impossible to say exactly what will happen and how it will happen. It's very much going down to the wire in terms of timing. However, it is highly probable that the UK will exit the EU at the end of March 2019, either without any sort of deal explaining how things will operate in the future, or with some sort of transition period in place to finalise the details of how the trade, etc., will happen in the future, which could last 1, 2, 3, or perhaps even more years. We just don't know at the moment. If there is no deal, tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade may well come into existence, and the EU have published a position paper explaining what they imagine will happen when the EU, if the UK exits without a deal, and if you like, abruptly at the end of March 2019 becomes a third nation, and it's then treated the same way as China, Japan, India, the United States, all the other countries that don't have a trade deal with the EU. Now, one of the things that the UK needs to do at the time of actually leaving the EU is convert all the EU law it wants to keep into UK law. And as EU food contact law is highly technical in nature and supports both consumer protection and trade with the EU, and it is highly likely to be converted into UK law without changes. Essentially, the UK will have far more important things to deal with than food contact regulations. However, each EU regulation will actually get 4 statutory instrument numbers, each for England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. That will be a complicating factor. It is worth noting that the UK has never developed its own food contact legislation and is therefore unlikely to do so after Brexit. But it will still need to trade. After March 2019, UK companies trading materials and articles covered by harmonised legislation with companies based in the EU will obviously have to continue to comply with EU legislation. Similarly, when UK companies trade materials and articles not covered by harmonised legislation, companies based in the EU, then it will still be necessary to show compliance using national legislation and EU recognised risk assessment methods. So no change from the current position. To trade with the EU, doesn't matter where you are in the world, you have to do things the way the EU wants you to. The position in the UK itself is perhaps a bit cloudier. Immediately after Brexit, the UK will not have any food contact legislation covering articles and materials that are not harmonised. You can imagine potential problems when companies in the UK trade amongst themselves. However, one of the most important concepts in UK law is the general principle of exercising all reasonable care and all due diligence. And currently, that actually involves complying with EU legislation. So the easiest way of showing that you're exercising all reasonable care and all due diligence for unharmonised articles and materials will be by using European national legislation and EU recognised risk assessment methods. Although I suppose that it's possible that you could also argue that you could actually use compliance with FDA regulations as being an equivalent but different system. That's one for the lawyers to argue about. I don't think you could just go ahead and use anything granted a US food contact notification in the UK because of the way that the dietary exposure model works in the US, for example, which wouldn't necessarily apply to the UK at all. Anyway, we will see. Troubled waters lie ahead, and hopefully the politicians can manage to sort something out such that common sense prevails and trade continues to happen in a frictionless manner. Next slide, please. So, to conclude the presentation and summarise, the EU has developed a body of harmonised food contact legislation over the course of some 4 decades. However, despite this long period of time, there are still more materials not harmonised than are harmonised. Using the traditional model developed for plastics, for printed food contact materials, coatings, adhesives and paper and board will take some 100 years. A different approach needs to be developed. Now exists as a proposal for printed food contact materials. If adopted, this will result in amendment of the framework regulation and a whole host of work, which is going to take some years to actually get through. The framework regulation, which applies to all food contact materials whether harmonised is not, being reviewed for effectiveness, which may also cause it to be amended. And the framework regulation might also be affected by a proposed EU regulation on transparency of the food chain, which once again could also cause it to be amended. The effect of these three initiatives on the framework regulation is difficult to predict, but could be far-reaching and bring significant change to the processes of how food contact compliance is actually established. And the same, of course, is very true of the novel approach for printed food contact materials. That is a significant change to how compliance will be established. And as always, the thing to remember is the most difficult thing to predict is the future. So, next slide, please. I'd like to thank you for your attention and just finish off by saying what I do and how I can be contacted. Since 1996, I've been helping companies with all aspects of food contact, including complying with global legislation, notifying new food contact substances to EFSA, the US FDA and Health Canada, risk assessment of non-intentionally added substances and other unlisted substances, writing declarations of compliance for companies, getting the information needed from suppliers for companies, supporting documentation systems which underpin their declarations of compliance, auditing and improving quality assurance, quality control and supporting documentation systems, training employees to understand their responsibilities, thereby helping companies to ensure that their actions help them remain in compliance, and helping companies managing food packaging scares. And finally, last slide, please. Next slide, please. And this is just a list of the ways in which you can contact me if you wish to help you deal with any aspects of food contact talked about today or included on the list of things that I do. So with that, once again, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience and your time, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.